The following program is made possible by a generous grant from the Norda Family Trust. Additional financial support was also provided by Bob and Christy Worsley, the K&B Powell Fund, and Dana and Chris Doggett.
On a bluff overlooking a horseshoe bend of the Mississippi River stands a dramatic stone edifice facing the setting sun. In design and materials, this building is a near-perfect match to the 1840s original that for less than 10 years graced this same piece of ground. The building was a phenomenon of its time, standing tall in the frontier town of Nauvoo, Illinois. In other communities, such an imposing structure would serve as a courthouse or seat of government. But the builders of this edifice were housing what they believed had a far greater purpose. This was to be a temple, a sacred house for God. The Mormons devoted 5 long years to the temple's construction and then abandoned it in a forced mass exodus west. By 1850, the vacant temple had toppled, a victim first of an arsonist's torch and then a tornado. For nearly a century and a half, that sacred ground hosted other purposes. In 1999, the same church that had shaped the first structure and then fled for its life and the lives of its members announced plans to rebuild, using the original plans and placing the new structure on the former's footprint. Artisans, laborers, and craftsmen once again willed their work to be fitting of a temple built in tribute to Almighty God.
The town lay as in a dream, under some deadening spell of loneliness. Plainly it had not slept long. Rains had not entirely washed away the prints of dusty footsteps. I went into empty workshops, rope walks, and smithies. No one called out to me from any opened window. In the city graveyard, there was no record of plague. In and around the splendid temple, armed men were buried, surrounded by their stacks of musketry and pieces of heavy ordnance. They told the story of the dead city, that it had been a notable manufacturing and commercial mart, sheltering over 20,000. That they had waged war with its inhabitants for several years and had been finally successful only a few days before my visit. They also conducted me inside the massive sculptured walls of the curious temple, in which they said the banished inhabitants were accustomed to celebrate the mystic rites of an unhallowed worship. The city? It was Nauvoo, Illinois. The Mormons were the owners of that city and the smiling country around. And those who had stopped their plows, who had silenced their hammers, their axes, their shuttles, and their workshop wheels, those who had put out their fires, who had eaten their food, spoiled their orchards, and trampled underfoot their thousands of acres of unharvested bread, these were the keepers of their dwellings, the carousers in their temple. Colonel Thomas L. Kane.
America in the 19th century cradled a host of religious movements. Conspicuous among them was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which grew from its 1830 upstate New York beginnings to a host of congregations across the nation and in the British Isles. Their story is a curious one that speaks of a people bludgeoned by public opinion and even mob violence, yet resolute and resilient in building what they considered would be the kingdom of God on earth. These religionists believed that their leader, Joseph Smith, was a prophet called by the Almighty to restore the ancient Church of Jesus Christ. When he said, "I talked with God," they believed him, and they shared that conviction with thousands as they spread what they claimed was the good news of the gospel. They held that the second coming of the Lord was near, that priesthood authority had been restored to the earth, and that their newly revealed scripture, the Book of Mormon, a second witness of Jesus Christ, joined the teachings of the Holy Bible as the word of the Lord. They were called Mormons.
People were attracted to Mormonism because it sought to reshape the nature of Christianity in America, which had been bedeviled by a whole series of denominational schisms, divisions, differences between Catholics and Protestants.
The early converts to the church were looking for the true church of Jesus Christ, a restored church. They were hungry for salvation. There were a lot of competitors for their interest, and they found in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that which they were looking for.
At the call of Joseph Smith, converts gathered from New England, the mid-Atlantic states, and Canada to two settlements on the fringes of the raw-boned frontier, one in Kirtland, Ohio, the other in Independence, Missouri. Their efforts at community were more than working the land. They intended to build a house for God in the tradition of Old Testament temples.
The advent of several hundred strangers into the midst of the insignificant hamlet was an event of considerable importance. But when they selected a most commanding site for their temple, all northern Ohio looked on in wonder. Frederick G. Mather.
The Kirtland Temple, a 3-story sandstone building with a skin of plaster, represented 3 years of sacrifice and untiring labor of an impoverished people whose numbers swelled with each influx of believers turned Mormon settlers. The temple dedication in 1836 surpassed their expectations.
No mortal language can describe the heavenly manifestations of that memorable day. Angels appeared to some, while a sense of divine presence was realized by all present, and each heart was filled with joy inexpressible. Eliza R. Snow.
But rising tensions eclipsed those days of glory. Mormons did not mesh well with their fiercely independent neighbors, not in Ohio, not in Missouri. Merging spiritual and temporal into a modern-day Zion became their undoing. In 1838, the Mormons fled Kirtland, leaving behind a string of homes, farms, and their temple. They regrouped in far west Missouri, but their stay was short-lived. Mob violence a few years earlier had forced the Saints in Independence into exile before they even broke ground for a temple. Efforts to build one in far west were blocked as well. Misunderstandings, overzealous religious expression, economic jealousies, frontier lawlessness, and disorder again bred violence. On October 27, 1838, Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs threatened that if they did not leave, the Mormons would be exterminated. In a desperate winter march of 1838 and 39, thousands of Mormons escaped with little more than their lives. They straggled east into Quincy, Illinois, seeking shelter and a new start.
The inhabitants of Quincy were very kind to us as a people and did all they could to give our brethren employment. and assisted many that were in need, and many were sick. Sarah P. Rich.
In 1839, there were about 1,500 people here in Quincy, and those settlers welcomed 5,000 Mormons that had been forcibly driven from the state of Missouri under harsh winter conditions, had walked across the frozen Mississippi, and they were offered food and clothing and shelter. Now, to put that in perspective, that would be like the 42,000 residents of Quincy today taking care of 150,000 refugees. So I think that proud tradition of 1839 represents what perhaps is one of the greatest acts of humanity in the history of our country.
That spring, Joseph Smith secured property for his people upriver from Quincy. He named the boggy horseshoe bend on the Mississippi Nauvoo, a Hebrew term signifying how longed for or beautiful location.
We were again to start anew, to make another home with nothing but our hands and brains to begin with. We were not conquered in spirit, but determined to live our religion. Nancy Huntington Tracy.
We soon expect to see numerous inhabitants, saints, thickly studding the flowery and widespread prairies of Illinois, temples for the worship of our God, erecting in various parts, and great peace resting upon Israel. Joseph Smith.
We quickly resolved we will stay here as long as Joseph wants us to. He knows what is best. Oliver B. Huntington.
When he said, "This is the will of the Lord," that was as if Peter himself had spoken to the early saints.
Nauvoo obviously grew, not so much because people generally wanted to be there. It grew because followers of Joseph Smith wanted to be there.
The first summer, so many died of fever bred in the wetlands that authorities preached a general funeral sermon every Monday and Thursday.
Death became so frequent a visitor in Nauvoo that we were perfectly familiar with it. Caroline Crosby.
Nauvoo seemed to have been held in reserve to meet the occasion, for none but saints full of faith and trusting in the power of God could have established that city. Eliza R. Snow.
Nauvoo was not about building a city. Joseph Smith called for the saints to erect a house for the worship of God. In 1841, he announced that he had received by revelation the Lord's command to build a temple where the people would be blessed and crowned with honor, immortality, and eternal life.
You will be rewarded by that God whose servants you are, and your names will be handed down to posterity as saints of God.
Joseph Smith built upon religious tradition that a temple connects heaven to earth.
In all of the great temple-building cultures, there has been the underlying idea of revelation and of contact between heaven and earth. The temple-building peoples do not simply go out and start building temples. They are instructed to do so by divine revelation. As they perceive that, God chooses someone to be his prophet, to be the mouthpiece on earth for his people of these revelations. And the building of the temple is part of that whole process. So one of the things that is revealed is the temple.
He was convinced that the culmination of human history and of sacred history and the preparation for the millennium could not really come to pass in fullness unless the people were prepared through temples. And therefore, from the beginning of the church's history, he was more concerned that they dedicate ground and begin a temple than that they build what we would call chapels or meeting houses, or in the Jewish lore, a synagogue. They failed twice and were driven. Now we're in Nauvoo, which is itself the very city of the saints, and he insists we need the temple more than anything else.
In 1841, a work crew of these religious refugees began chipping away the limestone walls of the Mississippi riverbank on this western edge of Illinois. Like the Israelites of old, these believers were intent on building a temple for God, one stone at a time.
The temple of the Lord is in process of erection here, where the saints will come to worship the God of their fathers, and where instructions from the Most High will be received. Joseph Smith.
Essentially a massive public works project, the temple would order not only religious life, but the economic, social, and political nature of Nauvoo as well. These faithful began building the Nauvoo temple before they had a meeting hall or church, before many of them even had homes.
I started with the first load of stone that was hauled for the temple, but as I had an ox team, Lorenzo Brown got to the temple ground first, as he had a horse team. William Allred.
Joseph Smith selected William Weeks to craft plans for the Nauvoo temple, but retained the role as chief architect.
I wish you to carry out my designs. I have seen in vision the splendid appearance of that building illuminated, and will have it built according to the pattern shown me. Joseph Smith.
Labor on the Nauvoo temple inched forward at first. Workmen laid out a foundation, began digging a cellar, and by early spring had shaped the walls high enough for a grand ceremony April 6, 1841, to set the cornerstones.
Mormon restorationism was aimed at recovering the correct model of the temple that God had instructed the Israelites to create. The temple is the center of the universe because this is where God dwells among men, and this is where Israel meets God face to face. Scripture is explicit on these points. There can't be any other center once you have posited that God is dwelling in this place. Then this is the very center of creation and of the world. This is their conviction.
In the huge chief cornerstone, Brother Joseph had placed a Bible, a Book of Mormon, hymn book, and other church works. It made me think of the prophets of ancient days, hiding up their records to come forth in some future generation. Nancy Tracy.
A countless multitude thronged around to see the prophet, the master spirit of the glittering scene, accompanied by many of his fellow officers and friends, aye, and some pretended friends too. Norton Jacobs.
One of the guests at Joseph's side was 22-year-old Thomas Coke Sharp, editor of the newspaper in Warsaw, a community 15 miles south that saw Nauvoo as a rival for river trade. Fiery and ambitious, Sharp became a bitter foe of the church and its leaders.
I was assigned to hold Sharp's horse during the ceremonies. I watched him, and it seemed he conceived an animosity toward the saints that day, out of envy. Norton Jacobs.
The evil one was stirring up the hearts of the people, for he knew blessings would be poured out upon the saints in that house. However, the Lord held the enemy at bay for the present. Nancy Tracy.
The Springfield, Illinois State Register suggested that Sharp and the Warsaw Town Fathers were afraid that Nauvoo would blunt their economic prospects.
Whenever they, as a people, step beyond the proper sphere of religious denomination and become a political body, as many of our citizens are beginning to apprehend will be the case, then this press stands pledged to take a stand against them. Thomas Sharp, Warsaw Signal.
The success of Nauvoo very definitely contributed to its downfall. Because it grew so rapidly, it became alarming to competing communities in Hancock County, Carthage and Warsaw most particular. But perhaps even more important, it definitely was going to dominate the county politically.
Joseph clashed with Sharp and to show his displeasure, canceled his subscription to the paper.
Sir, you will discontinue my paper. Its contents are calculated to pollute me, and to patronize the filthy sheet, that tissue of lies, that sink of iniquity, is disgraceful to any moral man. Yours with utter contempt, Joseph Smith.
While work on the temple took precedence over other construction, the project lagged. Some questioned Joseph Smith's timing in dispatching the Quorum of the 12, his fellow church leaders, to England to preach what they called the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Their strength could have been used in Nauvoo. A bold missionary effort in England a few years earlier had produced a flurry of converts.
His servants were sent into my native town, where I was privileged with hearing their voices, and was led by one into the waters of baptism on a cold November night. Thomas Bullock.
The missionary's message had appeal, particularly with the working class.
Mormonism's promise to lead English laborers out from their Egypt of taskwork and subjection has made them rally round the new religion as around a new Moses sent from God. Birmingham Daily Press.
British gathered to Nauvoo by ship, paying £15 apiece for steerage class.
I felt it my duty to go, although it was a severe trial to me, in my feelings to leave my native land. I knew in whom I had trusted, and with the fire of Israel's God burning in my bosom, I forsook my home. Jane Robinson.
The promise was a wonderful dream of a kingdom that could be made real here and now upon earth, not off in the future somewhere, but economic promise, psychological security, family strength and direction. The stories of what these people heard and how they understood the gospel of Mormonism is really an inspiring one for these people abroad.
In the next few years, British converts would infuse strength, capital, and expertise so desperately needed for the temple.
Joseph Smith's mysterious and awful claims to divine inspiration make his voice to believers like the voice of God, trained to sacrifice their individuality, utter one cry, and to think and act in crowd. Alton Telegraph.
Mormonism transformed itself from a small movement led by a single prophet into a massive, deeply rooted, highly variegated institution within 20, 30 years, a shorter period of time than was experienced in the development of almost any other religious movement in the history of the world.
Master stonemason William W. Player emigrated to Nauvoo, having left his imprint on bridges, walls, and the graceful stone arches of St. James Chapel in England's potteries. Player's expertise energized the lagging temple effort, totally dependent on donated supplies and inexperienced labor.
The work progressed but slowly during this season, having but one crane. But the delays are through the stone not being cut fast enough. William Clayton.
The prophet Joseph worked with his own hands, quarrying the stone for its walls, when his enemies were not pursuing him. John Pulsifer.
By fall, Player had set stone to the first-floor windowsills. The walls stood 4 feet above ground through the winter. The temple soon gained attention of the press and drew curious visitors.
When completed, the temple will be the most splendid and imposing architectural monument in the New World. A temple as unique and wonderful as the faith of its builders. John Greenleaf Whittier.
Brother Joseph called for the people to give 10% of their time and their resources to build the Nauvoo temple. men were expected to commit 1 day in 10 to the workforce. He called it tithing.
I intend to keep the door at the dedication myself, and not a man shall pass who has not paid his tithes. Joseph Smith.
They had promised the Lord in their baptism that they'd remember him, keep his commandments, and do what he wanted. When he said, build me a temple, they said, well, you've given us everything we've got. Everything we have comes from you. We'll give back 10%.
A few laborers on the temple received wages, which for the most part amounted to meager foodstuffs. Most tithes were paid in kind.
Many times I have worked on the stone quarry on the banks of the Mississippi River and had nothing for dinner but cornbread, when dry, dipped in the river, and worked drilling rock day after day, as cheerful and contented as ever was in my life. James Lighthead.
Lumber for the temple came from pine forests in Wisconsin. 44 work crews harvested more than 1.5 million board feet of lumber and 200,000 shingles. The lumber was floated downstream as rafts, usually several hundred feet in length and width. The trip took a week, sometimes 2.
Every rapids, every dam, every pier and boom below a mill were a potential danger. Brother Cunningham was drowned this summer above the mills. He got in a whirl in the river and was seen no more. Joseph Holbrook.
Women joined in the effort. In 1842, Joseph Smith established a female relief society whose members contributed garden produce, stitched shirts for the workmen, and organized a penny drive raising $1,000 for supplies.
We have not said, be ye warmed and clothed, without trying to do it. Sister Peg.
With the assistance of the sisters, we expect to get the nails and glass. And with the assistance of the brethren, we expect to do the rest. We expect to get the roof on by December and do all of the inside next winter. And then we will dedicate it. Many blessings depend upon it. Wandle Mace.
The Lord gave a commandment that a temple should be built to his name. It seemed almost impossible for so poor a people to build such a temple in their poverty, but the Lord never requires more of men than they can perform if they will go to with their might and trust in him. John Pulsifer.
They had what they considered to be a revelation from on high that said, if you have power to build it, it will be because you keep my commandments. And if you do not, then the love of the Father will not continue with you, and you will walk in darkness. Now that's pretty strong. And though they didn't understand fully why a temple was crucial to their spiritual lives, they accepted that. And they went to work and built it.
The Nauvoo faithful believed that in the temple, they would secure their salvation.
Generations yet unborn will dwell with peculiar delight upon the scenes that we have passed through, the all but insurmountable difficulties that we have overcome in laying the foundation of a work that fired the souls of the ancient patriarchs and prophets, a work that is destined to bring about the glory of God and the salvation of the human family. Joseph Smith.
The idea that the Latter-day Saints at that time, under such trying circumstances, in such difficult conditions, would have and could have built this extraordinary building and devoted so many of their resources and their energies to this seemingly impractical enterprise is, to me, astonishing, and it puts them in the tradition of the great temple building cultures where people give virtually everything to build these great temples. Why? Because it is a meeting place of heaven and earth.
The rising temple was the most prominent structure for hundreds of miles.
The temple is going to be the major public building, and it's sited beautifully on the bluff, so it can be seen as you're coming up the river from the south, down the river from the north, making the bend of the river, or anywhere on the Iowa side. It's going to be a landmark.
The building of the Mormon temple, under all the troubles by which those people have been surrounded, seems to be carried on with a religious enthusiasm which reminds us of olden times. The New York Sun.
In the spring of 1844, the prophet Joseph escorted Josiah Quincy, a notable from Boston, to the building site.
Near the entrance to the temple, we passed a workman who was laboring upon a huge sun, which he had chiseled from the solid rock. General Smith said, the man looking up from his task, "Is this like the face you saw in vision?" "Very near it," answered the prophet. Josiah Quincy.
The carving of the unusual sunstones, moonstones, and starstones provoked both interest and discussion.
When I look at the sunstone, what I see are mallets and chisels and sanding devices and just the ropes necessary to haul these one-ton pieces. The symbolism of the sunstone is very complex. Many of those symbols can be found in both the Old and the New Testament. But to me, I want to concentrate on the sun itself, because I think that most people agree that that face rising behind the clouds with the trumpets above is doing one thing. It's announcing a new beginning.
Wherever you had sun, moon, and stars, as on grave markers or other public buildings, it was a symbol of heaven. They were heavenly bodies, and where heaven is, God is present. So that reinforces the fact that God's presence is there in the temple.
The sun and the moon and the stars, we are taught in modern revelation, are symbolic of the very light of Christ, that he himself is in and of, and the creator of such light. The temple is a house of light. So the saints came to the temple and saw on its exterior the very prophecy of the destiny of righteousness, meaning the fullness of the light of God.
Joseph Smith spoke of building a temple on the scale and with the purpose of Christ's ancient church. Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, a structure of untold magnificence, stood for hundreds of years as the most heralded house of the Lord.
I obligate myself to build as great a temple as ever Solomon did, if the church will back me up. Joseph Smith.
It was first and foremost a kind of palatial residence that would be befitting a powerful deity. And the very term temple, actually, at least in the Hebrew Bible, is in the Hebrew text itself, is really the house of the Lord.
For the children of Israel in the wilderness, they had a mobile temple. That was the tabernacle. Out of that tradition then came the temple at Jerusalem, Solomon's stone-on-stone temple, and that in turn to the so-called Second Temple, built with Nehemiah, and that was the temple that then Herod enlarged in the time of Jesus. As for Jesus himself, he speaks of the temple as his Father's house, then as his house, and then as your house.
Many early temples were built atop mountains, where people believed they could have direct communion with God. Archaeologists have uncovered grand structures in the Western Hemisphere, constructed after the pattern of the Temple of Solomon, but fashioned of fewer precious materials.
The first great object before us is to help forward the completion of the temple, for God requires a house wherein his servants may be instructed and endowed with power from on high. Joseph Smith.
As a man of intellectual curiosity, he studied, he learned, he observed, but the ultimate source, as far as I am aware, the ultimate source for his information on the temple can only have come through revelation, because such information as is reflected in the Mormon temples was not available to him at that time through study or research.
Joseph saw the Nauvoo temple as the culmination of his ministry.
If it should be the will of God that I live to see this temple completed, I will say, O Lord, it is enough. Let thy servant depart in peace. Joseph Smith.
This was his crowning objective. This was the great desire of his heart. This represented his final great effort. And to have it restored now, to the extent that it's possible to do so, must, I think, be a very satisfying thing for him.
Early in his ministry, Joseph Smith had taught the doctrine of baptism as a necessary step to salvation. In 1840, he extended that teaching to include the ancient practice of what he termed baptism for the dead.
We were strung up and down the Mississippi, baptizing for our dead. Wilford Woodruff.
The Lord has manifested to us this duty and privilege, and we are commanded to be baptized for our dead. It is no more incredible that God should save the dead than that he should raise the dead. Joseph Smith.
His revelation said there is hope after life, and we'll be rejoined as families, and we can do something here on the earth through proxy ordinances of baptism that will give that person a Christian chance for a Christian life after this life.
In 1841, the prophet Joseph announced that baptisms for the dead were to be performed in the temple. In the basement of the rising structure, craftsmen quickly constructed a baptismal font hewn from pine.
I viewed the foundation of a mighty temple, with a baptismal font resting on the backs of 12 oxen, probably the first one built since the days of Solomon. I then went to the stonecutter's shop, where the sound of many workmen's mallets and the sharpening of the smith's anvil all bore the unmistakable evidence of a determined purpose to complete the mighty structure. Gilbert Belknap.
On November 21st, 1841, baptisms for the dead were commenced in this last dispensation, in a temple of God. John Henry Smith.
What a glorious thing it is that we believe, and can be baptized for all of our dead, and save them as far back as we can get any knowledge of them. Sally Randall.
When they lost a family member, they grieved. So for Joseph Smith to say we have priesthood authority that can seal these families, join them together in an eternal relationship that extends beyond this life, it was an attraction that meant something to them. It not only joined husband and wife and families with children, but the extended family up and down the generations.
To Joseph Smith, the temple was a place for both worshiping Jesus Christ and learning about the nature of God and man, the purpose of mortality, and the promise of life hereafter. This holy ceremony, he contended, was the same as that received by the ancient apostles on the day of Pentecost. He called it the endowment.
The endowment breaks into three main parts. It is, first of all, like baptism, a making of covenants with God. It, secondly, is a place of instruction, why there is even an earth and how it is made, and how we then are to relate to it and to the future. And third, Latter-day Saint temples were designed for vicarious or proxy service for and in behalf of those who have gone before. And that includes even the covenant of marriage.
Great attention was given to the introduction of marriage for eternity, which Joseph likened to the promises given to Abraham.
I received from Joseph the first idea of eternal family organization. The result of our endless union would be an offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven or the sands of the seashore. Joseph had merely lifted a corner of the veil and given me a single glance into eternity. Harley P. Pratt.
In May 1842, in a special meeting on the second floor of his red brick store, Joseph Smith introduced a handful of men to the ritual of the temple. Their wives also participated in these ceremonies in subsequent sessions.
When he saw that his earthly days might be ended before the completion of the temple, he called a chosen few and conferred upon them the ordinances of the holy endowments, so that the divine treasures of his mind might not perish from the world with his death. Franklin Richards.
Joseph would rely upon those close to him, those to whom he had given the temple teachings, to carry the work forward in the Nauvoo temple.
Joseph said in his last charge to his apostles, "I have desired to see this temple built. I shall never see it completed, but you will." Wilfred Woodruff.
The temple represented the acme of their gospel teachings, principles. It was concerned with the things of immortality, the things of eternity, the continuity of the human family, things that meant so very, very much to these people.
These exiles thought that they were founding the city of God, the metropolis of mankind. They considered themselves the renovators of the world. Hippolyte Taine.
The emerging Mormon stronghold threatened the surrounding towns. While the population of most settlements near Nauvoo did not exceed 1,000 citizens, Nauvoo's numbers quickly outpaced Springfield, the state capital, and soon rivaled Chicago as one of the largest cities in the state. By 1845, resident numbers topped 12,000.
In the 1840s, the three largest towns in Illinois were Galena, Chicago, and Nauvoo. Chicago was a place that was going to benefit enormously from its location at the foot of Lake Michigan and the fact that just about all the business in the country that goes from east to west, one way or another, has to pass through Chicago. Galena, on the other hand, another boom town, was a place that clearly was going to have a short half-life because it was dependent on mineral that was being dug out of the ground. Nauvoo is a utopian community, and its principal resident happens to be a prophet of God. And so clearly it's quite different from the other two kinds of boom towns.
The liberal charter granted by the state legislature gave the town preeminence as a city-state, with full control in the hands of the Mormon hierarchy. Neighboring communities viewed Nauvoo as a renegade society, living by its own rules.
The hostile spirit and conduct manifested by Joseph Smith and many of his associates are decidedly at variance with the true spirit of Christianity, and should not be encouraged by any people, much less by those professing to be the ministers of the gospel of peace. William Law.
In the first quarter or so of the 19th century, Americans were proud of the fact that they enjoyed diversity, but there were limits, obviously. In the case of the Mormons in Nauvoo, it seemed as though those limits had been reached, if not exceeded.
Nauvoo had its own military force, aimed at protecting the community from aggressions they had faced in previous locales. Commissioned by the state legislature, The Nauvoo Legion was one of the largest standing military forces in the nation.
They seemed to be, in truth, a motley crew, some with one pistol, some with two, others with a pike or harpoon, and we even saw some with a brace of horse pistols, a gun and sword. Alton Telegraph.
River traffic brought traders, notable visitors, excursion parties from New Orleans and St. Louis, and thousands of emigrants from the British Isles. By 1843, 4 or 5 steamboats a day stopped at Nauvoo.
They are all influenced by a public spirit unknown to the most of our communities. They present the appearance of an enterprising, industrious, sober, and thrifty population indeed, and have no rivals east, and we rather guess, not even west of the Mississippi. St. Louis Atlas.
The city of Nauvoo, with its wide streets sloping gracefully to the farms enclosed on the prairie, seemed to be a better temple to him who prospers the work of industrious hands than the grotesque structure on the hill, with all its queer carvings of moons and suns. Josiah Quincy.
But with their neighbors, Mormons were quickly wearing out their welcome. Laws outside the boundaries of Nauvoo had little muscle in the Mormon town. Nauvoo not only dominated the bend of the river, but the dynamics of the entire county, its elections, its economic initiatives, its military prowess.
Their religious and political creed are identical, and as directly at variance with the spirit of our institutions as any system that man could possibly devise. Alton Telegraph.
Common scripture, like the common schools of Horace Mann, was a foundation upon which American culture, so it seemed, was being built. Here was a group that had, in some sense, seemed to have rejected this scripture. They hadn't really rejected it, but that was a perception that certainly pervaded much of the public reaction to Mormonism.
In the end, Mormons found themselves with no allies.
It is indeed unfortunate for the peace that they do not divide in elections according to their individual preferences or political principles, like other people. Governor Thomas Ford.
You have a lot of hostility and outright violence from the Gentile neighbors, perhaps not directly trying to keep them from finishing the temple, but just generally causing trouble, and there was thievery and attempted arson and things like that. It was just generally to try to, I think, perhaps on one hand, hurry them to get them away, and on the other hand, if the temple's this important, then we want to interrupt the building of it because that'll be bad for them.
Our opinion is that either the old citizens or the Mormons must leave. The country cannot be quieted until the expulsion of one or the other is effected. Thomas Sharp, Warsaw Signal.
When I cast mine eyes out, what do I behold? Every brother armed, his gun upon his shoulder to protect his family. Ah, liberty, thou art fled. When the wicked rule, the people mourn. Zina Huntington Jacobs.
By the spring of that year, some of the church membership fractured into dissident groups. There were those who could not abide the unfolding of new doctrines, those who sought power, those who lost heart. Outside antagonists added to the growing furor.
This is the work of God. And if you turn against it and withdraw from it, it will still roll on, and you will not be missed. Joseph Smith.
To rally support, a band of defectors published a newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, which attacked land policies, political control, and church doctrines and practices.
If the citizens of Nauvoo lay their hands upon it or break it, they may date their downfall from that very hour. And in 10 days there will not be a Mormon left in Nauvoo. Francis Higbee.
The town council ordered the press destroyed. The paper's first printing was its last.
About 6 p.m., a company consisting of some 200 men marched to the building and, breaking through the door, tumbled the press and materials into the street and set fire to them. We made no resistance, but looked on and felt revenge, but leave it for the public to avenge this climax of insult and injury. Charles A. Foster.
On the frontier, authority is up for grabs, and here was a group that seemed to define its authority, locate its authority, even enforce its authority with a leadership that was strong.
If I'm a farmer in Hancock County, Illinois, I hate them because they work together and they're prosperous and they succeed, and I don't have anybody to work with me, and I'm scrabbling around on my little farm all by myself. They're economically prosperous, they vote as a bloc, and they're literate and they're skilled, and I'm none of those things, and I don't like it, and I'm going to get rid of them.
The Warsaw citizens supported conflict, voting $1,000 for arms and ammunition. Other towns in Hancock County followed suit.
We hold ourselves at all times in readiness to cooperate with our fellow citizens, to exterminate, utterly exterminate the wicked and abominable Mormon leaders. Thomas Sharp, Warsaw Signal.
At the insistence of the governor and with his promise of protection, Joseph Smith surrendered to authorities in Carthage, the Hancock County seat. A last look at the temple marked the young leader's departure from his beloved Nauvoo.
It is thought by some that our enemies would be satisfied with my destruction. But I tell you that as soon as they have shed my blood, they will thirst for the blood of every man in whose heart dwells a single spark of the spirit of the fullness of the gospel. Joseph Smith.
3 days later, a mob of nearly 250 vigilantes attacked the jail holding Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram and 2 other church leaders. In the swift assault, Joseph and Hiram were murdered. The 2 returned to Nauvoo in pine coffins.
I cannot describe the sorrow the church was thrown into at this time. Men, women, and children wept and cried aloud when the news came in that our brethren were killed. Sarah P. Rich.
The enemies of the Mormons, which included large numbers in Hancock County as well as some former church members, assumed that killing the prophet would end what they considered a misguided religion and its rule.
There is a report that Joe Smith, the Mormon prophet, and his brother have been murdered while in jail under the protection of the governor of the state by a band of ruffians. So much for Mormonism. Thomas Edmond.
Our opposers thought they had destroyed our religion, overthrown our cause, but the work rolled on. Elizabeth Ann Whitney.
I think probably there was more satisfaction in Warsaw than any other place when Smith was murdered.
Mormonism could very easily have unraveled when Joseph Smith was assassinated, because there were many voices, many criers of doom, many criers of follow me. Brigham Young's voice eventually became the strongest voice.
By the time of Smith's assassination, it was already a broadly based religious movement, an institution of real power and authority within its own and among its own members. And that was extraordinary. That is one of the characteristics that sets Mormonism apart from almost all other new religious movements.
Rocked by the loss of their prophet, the church struggled, but it did not collapse.
The Lord could raise up another to build on the foundation that was already laid. Nancy Tracy.
Several contended for leadership of the 34,000 members scattered from Nauvoo across the Atlantic to England. 44-year-old Brigham Young, by right of his position as senior member of the Quorum of the 12, marshaled the support of the badly shaken church.
I inquired of the Lord whether we should stay here and finish the temple. The answer was, we should. Brigham Young.
Brigham Young was unlike Joseph Smith in that he was never as controversial. He was a superb institutional leader. He was a superb politician, and he was a prophet who continued in Smith's vein, but did not upend Smith's principal teachings.
Finishing the temple galvanized the people to a cause. In the next 18 months, laborers would accomplish as much on the temple as in the previous 3 years.
Out of my bedroom window, I could see the masons at work and could hear the click of their hammers and hear their sailor songs as they pulled the rock in place with pulleys. Nancy Tracy.
I did considerable work on the Nauvoo Temple, planting up boards and laying floors in the attic and tower. After this, I went to work on the arsenal. Jacob Pearl.
I gave my husband's watch to help build the Nauvoo Temple and everything else that I could possibly spare, and the last few dollars that I had in the world. Elizabeth Hurd.
By the fall of 1844, limestone blocks for the second story were laid, and the first of the large sunstones was raised into place. Next came carved moonstones and five-pointed star stones.
William W. Player put up the first star on the southeast corner of the temple. The stars will add much to the beauty of the temple. Brigham Young.
A special sunrise ceremony heralded the laying of the final capstone, May 24th, 1845.
President Young placed the stone in position and said, "The last stone is now laid upon the Nauvoo Temple, and I pray the Almighty, in the name of Jesus, to defend us in this place, and sustain us until the temple is finished and we have all got our endowments." We doubt not that the angels looked upon it and rejoiced. Helen Mar Whitney.
As the temple neared completion, the people grew anxious to participate in what they deemed its sacred purpose.
I think temples today give us a sense of sacred space. That is, they're a space in which people can feel the presence of God and where people can come together as a community and feel joined to each other in the worship of their particular God.
You get this in Exodus 3, where there's a burning bush, and God speaking out of the bush says, "Take your shoes off your feet, because the ground on which you stand is holy." Sacred space is sanctified, set apart as holy by rites which distinguish it from ordinary space.
Soon, the faithful of Nauvoo were at cross purposes with their neighbors. Unrest festered and then erupted in outlying areas.
If they remain where they are, it is certain that this entire generation will witness constant turmoil, collision, outrage, and perchance extensive bloodshed. Can anyone be sure that they can be got rid of forever? William P. Richards.
The war clouds began to gather around. Business was paralyzed, accepting the work on the temple, which was going on very rapidly. George Whitaker.
Rather than face warfare in the streets of their own city, church leaders planned a mass exodus to the undisputed lands of the western wilderness.
The 12 held a council and thought it advisable, as we were going west in the spring, to keep all things quiet. John Taylor.
Long before an announcement was made, the church authorities pored over maps and read diaries and journals of those who had pushed settlements overland to the distant coast. Their aim was to find a place unclaimed and undesirable to the advancing tide of American emigrants. With hopes of the temple being completed by spring, A formal dedication was planned for April 1846.
The roof of the temple is now about ready for the shingles. But Joseph and Hiram are not here. Zina Diantha Huntington Jacobs.
Great numbers of carpenters, masons, and other workmen are daily engaged in this arduous undertaking, so that not only is stone being prepared, but the sash, flooring, seats, and other things are progressing rapidly, so to rush the work forward that we shall be prepared to commence giving the endowments next fall. John Taylor.
The plasterers have commenced this morning to plaster the arched ceiling of the lower hall of the temple. The floor is laid, the framework of the pulpits and surrounding seats for the choir and band is put up, and the work of fitting the room for dedication and holding meetings therein progresses very fast. William Clayton.
Uneasiness hung over the city.
I worked many a day in the temple with my rifle and sword hid in the shavings, hid because of the spies and false brethren with whom the city was filled. Curtis Edwin Bolton.
I can remember my father coming home in the night, having been on guard to make bullets in our fireplace. We were always in dread of the mobs. Matilda Lovelace.
Other religions were ridiculed in American society, but no other religion was as persecuted as Mormons.
The thing that held the Mormon community together was its religion. It was not a political community, an economic community. It was a religious community. And any group that is persecuted tends, if they survive the persecution, to be much more closely knit, much more steadfast in their devotion and in their commitment, and that certainly proved to be the case here.
The governor offered no support to the saints, saying, "I do not foresee the time when you will be permitted to enjoy quiet."
We assure the governor, if he can manage human butchers, he has nothing to fear from harmless, timid, and law-abiding Latter-day Saints. Willard Richards.
To keep the Mormons in line, the Illinois legislature revoked the Nauvoo City Charter. By the summer of 1845, bands of vigilantes torched 200 homes and outlying settlements, hoping to force the Mormons out.
It is a settled thing that the public sentiment of the state is against the Mormons, and it will be in vain for them to contend against it. Quincy Whig.
The people who had their houses burned fled into Nauvoo for shelter. Our house was filled with refugees. Bathsheba Smith.
Some of us was afraid we would not have time to finish the Nauvoo temple before these things came upon us. They were coming so fast. Wandle Mace.
It's not uncommon to find harsh physical violence, death, bombings, murder, beatings, and the burnings of homes, buildings, churches, farms. This was a commonplace phenomena in 19th century America. Not everywhere, but common enough that Americans knew how to practice this kind of violence, and they were good at it.
The saints, nearly 5,000 of them, gathered October 5th, 1845, for their first general meeting in the temple.
I opened the services of the day by a dedicatory prayer, presenting the temple thus far completed as a monument of the saints' liberality, fidelity, and faith, concluding, "Lord, we dedicate this house and ourselves to Thee." Brigham Young.
The question that arises is why the Mormons could not stay in Nauvoo. And there are many reasons. Their peculiarity, they were a peculiar people. Their military maneuvers, their political ambitions, their economic strangeness, their polygamy habits, all of this suggests it was time for the Mormons to go somewhere, and most people didn't care where.
Brigham Young and other members of the Council of 12 Apostles dodged warrants for their arrest on trumped-up charges while they readied the temple for ceremonies.
We broke up the encampment before sunrise to set off for Nauvoo, marched into the holy city without meeting with any resistance, marched to the temple and a small party sent in to search it. Quincy Rifleman.
The question that I think is asked most often by historians of the period, why would they finish the temple and knowing that they were going to leave it? And the answer is in their religious faith. They also know that they need the ceremonies of the temple in order to ensure their religious well-being.
The people voted unanimously to move en masse from the United States to someplace where they could live in peace. By November, 1,500 wagons were ready for the trek into the unknown West, and another 1,800 were in process. 4,000 yards of Russian duck canvas, originally purchased in the East to be used for a tabernacle near the temple, found new purpose as wagon covers and tents.
Men were thick as blackbirds, busily engaged upon the various portions of the temple. We labored while the wicked raged, the mobs howled, but they could not stop the work on the temple until it was so far completed that it was accepted of the Lord. Wandle Mace.
Men and women readied the temple for the long-awaited sacred work. Heber C. Kimball and his son hauled a wagon load of potted plants up the hillside. Members stripped their homes of furniture, paintings, and rugs to decorate the building.
Father Huntington locked up his chest of tools at the temple. The gospel net has caught all, and the building is fitly framed. Zina Diantha Huntington Jacobs.
On December 10th, 1845, Brigham Young opened the doors of the temple for the much-anticipated sacred work. Invitations were extended to those who had paid their tithes.
Many of the saints, men and women, had the privilege of receiving their endowments, learning the order of the priesthood, and the fall and redemption of man in the temple in the city of Joseph. John Pulsifer.
Joseph Smith had promised that in the temple, husbands and wives would be united forever in what he termed the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. To this union was tied the concept of plural wives, as given to ancient prophets Abraham and Jacob.
Polygamy was now made known to us for the first time, and while the majority of the church were made acquainted with the doctrine, it was only practically entered into by few. I was satisfied that it was a sacred revelation and that my religion required its acceptance. Jane Snyder Richards.
They thought of themselves as lineally tied to Abraham. And that's a tie with temple awareness, because Abraham and Sarah are given these sublime promises of priesthood and parenthood, and even the likeness of God.
This principle of marriage, coupled with Nauvoo's prominence as a major political and economic force in western Illinois, fed the rage of the church's enemies.
Brother Joseph Smith said some 2 years ago, about the time the temple was finished, all hell would be raised. The spirit of the people was raised to boiling heat. Norton Jacobs.
Politics in the long run represents the most important source of contention, but the religious aspect, particularly the allegations of polygamy, certainly provided the straw that broke the camel's back.
In 1890, the LDS Church denounced and abolished the practice of plural marriage. Day and night for the next 6 weeks, nearly 6,000 men and women in small companies received the promised blessings.
I worked in the temple every day without cessation until it was closed. I gave myself, my time, and attention to that mission. Elizabeth Ann Whitney.
The temple was accepted of the Lord, and his holy angels have ministered unto many therein. John Pulsifer.
One of the most important functions of temples in the ancient world, as of religious institutions today, was for the spiritual life of the individual, to help individuals who came to these edifices feel part of a larger purpose in the world, to be connected with the divine, and to help them understand themselves and how they can be better people in the world.
And the ritual, whether you knew what it was or didn't, whether you heard about it, you knew that something important, something of cosmic significance took place there, and that gave it stature. It moved beyond the mundane bread and butter issues, clearing the woods, plowing the ground, sowing the seed, reaping. Life had meaning beyond this, and the temple stood for that meaning that was beyond the mundane world.
February 1st, the residents of Nauvoo met in the temple for services. Just days before, they had placed a weather vane atop the tower.
They raised the vane, which is representation of an angel in his priestly robes, with the Book of Mormon in one hand and a trumpet in the other, overlaid with gold leaf. Peregrine sessions.
The town and the temple throbbed with activity in anticipation of the mass exodus. Earlier, the Mormons had promised their foes to leave when the grass grows and the water runs. But renewed threats prompted church leaders to hasten their exit. The first wagons crossed the river into Iowa on February 4th, 1846, to begin the journey west.
We commenced crossing the river, the weather being very cold and with large quantities of ice running in the river. We leave in the city of Nauvoo a good house of brick and a quantity of good furniture, without making a sale of anything. John Henry Smith.
Before leaving in an advance party, Brigham Young and members of the Quorum of the 12 quietly presented the temple to the Lord.
We dedicated the building to the Most High. We asked his blessing upon our intended move to the west. Also, we asked him to enable us someday to finish the temple and dedicate it to him. And we would leave it in his hands to do as he pleased, and to preserve the building as a monument to Joseph Smith. We ask the Lord to accept the labors of his servants in this land. Brigham Young.
The wrath and bloodthirsty spirit of our enemies, sustained and encouraged by state authority, at this time predominated to that degree that the labors in the temple were closed, and the energies of the saints directed towards a hasty flight. To what point we did not know, but go we must. Eliza R. Snow.
Now that the Mormons are gone, we can get back to peace and quiet again. Thomas Sharp, Warsaw Signal.
Left behind was the stately temple, several thousand homes, businesses, and nearly 1,000 saints, who in their poverty were struggling to secure teams and supplies for the journey. Their evacuation would string out until fall.
I might ask why it is that we have been to all this outlay and expense, such as building the temple, and then are called to leave it? I would answer that the people of God always were required to make sacrifices, and if we have a sacrifice to make, he is in favor of its being worthy of the people of God. Era Sabin.
The temple of the Lord is left solitary in the midst of our enemies. By the aid of the sword in one hand and trowel and hammer in the other, with firearms at hand and a strong band of police and the blessings of heaven, the saints, through hunger and thirst and weariness and watchings and prayings, completed the temple, despite the devices of the mob. And then, to save the lives of all the saints from cruel murder, we moved westward. Brigham Young.
If it had not been for the faith and knowledge that was bestowed upon us in that temple by the influence and help of the Spirit of the Lord, our journey would have been like one taking a leap in the dark. Sarah Rich.
It was there in that sacred house that under the authority of the holy priesthood those ordinances were administered, which gave to them the strength and conviction to move forward in the great undertaking which was ahead of them. And so very many of them gave their lives as a testimony of the conviction which they carried in their hearts.
The Mormons had hoped to sell the temple to finance their journey. Though there was interest, there were no buyers. Brigham Young left behind a party to finish the temple and publicly dedicate the building to God. Tickets for the May 1st service sold for $1.
When you dedicate a temple, you are sanctifying it. You are turning it into a sacred space. So a prayer of dedication delivers the temple to God. It is a house of the Lord. It is now suitable for His presence, for His Spirit to dwell there, for the people to go in and feel that peace.
In June 1846, hostile parties renewed attacks to expel the few remaining Mormons whose poverty had stalled their departure.
It began to be feared that many of the Mormons were not intending to leave the city, but to quietly remain, in the hope and expectation that in time the danger would be over. Thomas Gregg.
By September 10th, Nauvoo was under siege. Colonel Thomas Brockman and his troops bombarded Nauvoo with cannon fire. They stormed homes, roadways, and farms. The beleaguered residents responded with their own cannon fire, but they were no match for their assailants.
I well remember seeing the mob take possession of the temple, and how they climbed on the outside of the railing that was built around the top, about 1 foot from the edge, and marched around the temple. Anne Eliza Coffin Garner.
Whatever can be done should be done speedily in bringing this civil war and bloodshed to an end. Last night, Sunday, the roar of artillery which followed each other in rapid succession and which we hear distinctly in the town evinced that the third deadly strife was going on. Burlington, Iowa, Hawkeye.
Less than a week later, a mob of more than 1,500 marched down Mulholland Street to the temple.
So when the vigilantes came in and chased the last of the saints out and occupied it and vulgarized it, vandalized it, this army of occupation, in a sense, was making it a headquarters, and it was a way of desacralizing the temple.
Church Representative Henry Young gave up the temple keys to the aggressors.
The ferry boats were crowded, and the riverbank was lined with anxious fugitives sadly awaiting their turn to pass over and take up their solitary march to the wilderness. Mason Brayman.
Farewell, Nauvoo the beautiful, the city of Joseph, the home of so much joy and happy contentment, and also of the exquisite sorrow and anguish. Here I enjoyed the association of our beloved prophet and patriarch. Farewell to the temple upon which I have labored with so much pleasure, the second temple erected to the only true and living God. This was built by the energy, tithes, and offerings of an honest, although a poor, persecuted people. Wandle Mace.
2 years had passed since these believers had lost their leader, Joseph Smith. Now they had lost their city and their temple. Like Moses of old, Brigham Young led his people on a pilgrimage into the wilderness and west to build their Zion again. Nauvoo, once a boom town, now was still. The temple stood vacant. its glory short-lived.
It was a beautiful night, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, fire was discovered in the cupola. It spread rapidly, and in a very short period, the lofty spire was a mass of flame, shooting high in the air and illuminating a wide extent of country. Citizens gathered around, but nothing could be done to save the structure. In 2 hours, and before the sun dawned upon the earth, the proud structure, reared at so much cost, and a monument of religious zeal, stood with blackened and smoldering walls. Thomas Gregg.
A message to Salt Lake carried the news.
I would rather it should thus be destroyed than remain in the hands of the wicked. If it be the will of the Lord that the temple be burned, amen to it. Brigham Young.
Over an archway in the Nauvoo Temple, the saints who had already had the privilege of the temple and now had left to go west inscribed the words, "The Lord has beheld our sacrifice. Come after us." And they knew that they would lose the temple, not just leaving it, that it would likely be destroyed.
In 1850, a tornado ripped through Nauvoo, razing 3 of the 4 once mighty walls.
There shall not be left one stone upon another. Joseph Smith.
Colonel Thomas L. Kane visited Nauvoo in the fall of 1846 and found a ghost town.
No one met me there. I looked and saw no one. I could hear no one move, though the quiet everywhere was such that I heard the flies buzz and the water ripples break against the shallow of the beach. I walked through the solitary street. The Mormons in Nauvoo and its dependencies had been numbered the year before at over 20,000. Where were they? They had last been seen carrying in mournful train their sick and wounded, halt and blind, to disappear behind the western horizon, pursuing the phantom of another home. Hardly anything else was known of them, and people asked with curiosity, what had been their fate? What their fortunes? Colonel Thomas L. Kane.
The exiles spent their first winter in makeshift quarters on the banks of the Missouri River. In the spring of 1847, a vanguard company led by Brigham Young pushed across the plains to the desert valleys of the Great Basin. For the next 3 decades, streams of new converts followed their westering trail. They built towns, homes, farms, schools, and temples.
We shall come back to Nauvoo, and we shall build temples all over the continent of North America. Brigham Young.
A temple occupies a special place in our religious service. It isn't a chapel. It isn't a house of ordinary worship. It's a place of sacred ordinances. But these buildings are dedicated and consecrated and reserved for special ordinances which are sacred and meaningful to us.
The first builders of the Nauvoo Temple left a certain legacy, shaped by a people with grit and ingenuity, faith, resilience, and unbounded devotion to the Almighty. Surely it can be said they built better than their time. The Nauvoo Temple stands again today in tribute to a people and their God.
The city of the saints was to be nothing more than a memory until God should determine otherwise. It brought its joys, but its history was also full of sad reminiscences, apostasy, murderous intent, and destruction. I was taking a final farewell of Nauvoo for this life. I looked back upon the temple and city as they receded from view, and ask the Lord to remember the sacrifices of his saints. Wilford Woodruff.